So what I'd like to introduce you to is the United Nations Agenda 21. We're going to learn all about this tonight, and it also goes by another name, Sustainable Development. You'll find that these two terms are used interchangeably. Responsible for this, a book called Our Common Future. By 1987, that book was completed, and it outlined exactly what sustainable development would look like. So what we need to do is we need to take the resources from those nations that are destroying the earth, and we need to transfer those to other parts of the world. So the developing nations need to take the money from the wealthier nations. And in doing so, that's going to protect the environment. They said what we need to have is an Earth Summit. So they did. 5 years later, in 1992, in Rio de Janeiro, they had the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. That was called Agenda 21. That's where the name comes from. It's an agenda for the 21st century. And it was no longer 2 people in the basement of the United Nations in New York. All of a sudden, it was 18,000 people who showed up. And at this meeting, they codified what Agenda 21 was going to look like. So while this book talked about sustainable development, this book codified the report here. So we now have an action plan. Everybody in here heard the word Agenda 21? Have you heard it? You heard the name? Okay, this is it. This is Agenda 21. It's not a fantasy. It's not some tinfoil hat scheme. This is Agenda 21. And if you want to buy it, you can go on the United Nations website. But this now says what the world must look like and how we can roll it out and make that happen. In short, this is a high-level action plan. And Maurice Strong just so happens, remember Maurice? He was the guy that was trying to tie up all the fresh water, right? And the guy that's hiding out in China right now from the oil for food scandal. Okay, well Maurice is back. It's 1992, and now he's at the Earth Summit in Rio, and he walks out on stage. These were his opening remarks. Current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, the use of fossil fuels, electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing, are not sustainable. The Convention on Biological Diversity was part of the folks that got together to actually draw up this booklet that you see right here. They were part of one portion of the authors of this booklet. And they decided that, okay, that's pretty good, that's all right, that gives us a lot of information, but what we really need to do is we need something that's a practical tool for translating the principles of Agenda 21 into reality. So we need to make all this stuff at meetings into reality that's going to go somewhere. You know, booklets are fine, we need to do something with it. Well, if you're going to take over the whole world, I guess you need a little more, something a little bigger. So they got it. They created the Global Biodiversity Assessment, and that's what this guy is. And this Global Biodiversity Assessment chunks down the action plan that's in this book, in 40 chapters in this book, and it breaks it into a worldwide program and says what each nation is going to have to look like if we're going to actually save the planet. So in here it defines, and by the way, you can buy this. I got this from Cambridge University. There's only a few copies left, but they're floating around. You can get a hold of these things. So in here they define not only what the Earth has to look like when we get done, it's going to define what America is going to look like. And I'm going to show you what this book says America is going to look like. This is the book. But let's take a look inside this book, because in here it tells you what's not sustainable. So if it's not sustainable, what has to happen to it? It's got to go. It's got to go. It's got to be limited or eliminated. Well, here's what's in this book. Unsustainable activities. Do you like to ski? Well, skiing is considered unsustainable. Pastures where you can graze your horses. Do you like golfing? Anybody like to go on golf? Well, golf courses are considered unsustainable. Asphalt, macadam, roadways, concrete are considered unsustainable. Unsustainable human activities are dams. The scales of justice in the United States of America are unsustainable. All of this comes from this book, by the way. Private property is unsustainable. Americans have too much private property, and the majority of our wealth is tied up in private property. Therefore, one thing we need to do to return the Earth to its natural state is to begin to reduce the amount of private property that's held throughout the world, not just the United States, but throughout the world. Consumerism is unsustainable. And the family unit is unsustainable because we're suffering from overpopulation. But according to that book, we can only support about 1 billion people on the planet. Right now there's 7 billion, we're headed for 15 billion. How they're going to shrink that back down, I don't even want to think about. And most of all, we have what we call the Wildlands Program. Now, the Wildlands Program is what the United States will look like if this book is implemented. So on page 933 or 993 in here, it defines what the Wildlands Project is. And the intent of the Wildlands Project is to remove human beings from 50% of the United States. These red zones that you see up in here, out there, are no human habitation is allowed in those areas. The yellow zones around those are buffer zones. You'll be able to use those zones basically as protectionary and precautionary to see that nothing takes place inside these zones, which are fully at their natural vegetative state. The only people allowed in the buffer zones will be members of the federal government, officers, code enforcement, and so on and so forth. We're over here in these little dots that you might see here. And you'll see little black dots over here and little black dots over here. And those are what we call high-density habitats. In 1992, George H.W. Bush signed the agreement, a soft treaty in Rio, to implement Agenda 21, Sustainable Development in the United States. In June of 1993, Bill Clinton came along and he signed Executive Order 12852, which created the President's Council on Sustainable Development to begin implementation in federal agencies. And that's called this. Towards a Sustainable America. There are 7 of these, and you can download them. In here, he defines, the Council on Sustainable Development defines exactly what sustainable development is going to look like in the United States of America. So let's just trace the breadcrumbs, like Hansel and Gretel did. We're going to follow through, make sure we get back home again. Let's understand, we had Grow and Maurice and a team of 12 other people put together a report for the UN saying how we're going to save the United States, and this came out back in 1987. This said we need to develop a sustainable world, not just America, not just America. That report was codified in the UN Agenda 21 in 1992. George Bush signed on to it and agreed to everything that's in this book, the Global Biodiversity Assessment. It didn't mean anything because it was a soft treaty and had no teeth until Bill Clinton signed it into an executive order and established the President's Council on Sustainable Development. It is now in the United States. It's here. It crossed the borders. We can no longer say this is just some scheme in the basement of the UN at the end of 42nd Street. Well, it didn't stop there because once Bill signed the order, everybody else got on board. By 1997, the U.S. Conference of Mayors had created the Joint Center for Sustainable Communities. By 2001, the National Governors Association endorsed smart growth, advancing statewide sustainable development. And in 2011, President Barack Obama signed Executive Order 13575 and created the White House Rural Communities Act, enabling implementation of sustainable development in 16% of the United States of America. If you go into that book, which I just held up there, the President's Council on Sustainable Development is explicitly charged with recommending a national action plan on how to achieve a sustainable development in the U.S. The PCSD was conceived, and here it is, to formulate recommendations for the implementation of Agenda 21. So when somebody looks at you and they say, oh, you're nuts, we're not part of Agenda 21, I want you to go right to this website right here, or Google it. State Department submission to the 5th session of the Commission on Sustainable Development, or just State Department 5th session PCSD, that'll do it, April 1997. And you're going to find that the only reason the President's Council was formed was to implement Agenda 21. There was no other reason. So now we just bypassed Congress. There's nothing to vote on any longer. There's nothing that your council has to, the congressman or your senator has anything to do with, because we bypassed that whole process. When the President created an executive order, he now embedded it down in 11 of the federal agencies at that time. But he also partnered up with non-governmental organizations. And individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective. What kind of talking is this? The Rio Declaration says equity will be achieved through implementation of the international economic order and through transfers of resources to developing countries. Do you get what I'm talking about here? We're going to save the planet. We're not going to save the planet by living responsibly. We're not going to save the planet by recycling. We're going to save the planet by creating a whole new social structure among the people who live there. Now, this would be wacky if it was nothing but a report written in the basement of the United Nations in 1987. But that's not what it is anymore. Now it's here in the United States of America. It goes on to say that to achieve sustainable development, states, and all the United States is to the UN, just another state. Neither we get capitalized. But other than that, that's all we are. States should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. And we already know what the unsustainable patterns of production and consumption are because they're all outlined here in this report. In fact, all that is a plan to get to this. So unfortunately, when you walk out of here tonight, you're going to have to think about this stuff. Now, a lot of people never heard of Agenda 21. A lot of people never heard of the things that I'm talking about. Now I'm going to tell you why you haven't heard about it. I'm sure many people in this room heard Agenda 21 and they said, I'm not so sure about that. Well, it's no accident. In order to make all this function, in order to make this a reality, we needed two systems. One was smart growth. Smart growth essentially manages people and urban development, and the Wildlands Project manages the rural land. Between the two of them, they drive people off of the rural lands into the urban areas and get people out of automobiles and into bicycles and walking. That's where this walkable community all comes from. It's not just the nice idea that walking is good exercise. It's also the fact that we have another agenda here. And we're trying to fulfill this and see that this becomes a reality. In addition to these planning organizations implementing Agenda 21 throughout various communities. By the way, Agenda 21 is in every county in the United States of America. If you doubt me, then just plug in sustainable development, social equity. Let's separate this sustainable development, the kind you and I think of, which is healthy, from social equity, the UN thing, and your county, and see what pops up. You're going to find it in here. Also, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the World Resources Institute, International Union for Conservation in Nature, these all fund and provide grants and provide documentation and direction to implement a sustainable development Agenda 20, the Agenda 21 version of it. This just scrolls and goes on and on and on and on, and I just want to give you some kind of an idea of the impact that this group, ICLE, has here in the United States of America. So when somebody says ICLE is not part of the UN, excuse me, but they are part of it. They're not part of the UN, but they've been authorized by the United Nations to go into all these communities to implement the Agenda 21 program we were just talking about. Healthcare providers. What does healthcare providers have to do with sustainable development? Well, if you read Agenda 21, it says in here, every person on earth must be covered with health insurance. Now, am I saying that the Affordable Care Act that President Obama passed last year was part of Agenda 21? No, I'm not, because I don't know if he did it with this in mind or not. I can't get inside the guy's head. I don't know. All I know is it certainly works in concert with it, so it worked out rather well. If he did it or not is anybody's guess. But the reality is, healthcare was already written into Agenda 21 and already be signed on by the United States. And yes, this is happening across the United States in different communities. In Kings County, Washington, 141,000 acres was lost of homeowners. Homeowners' development rights were lost on 141,000 acres. 2,400 potential dwelling units were moved into urban areas. When you get involved with these community programs through this Agenda 21 program, everything is predetermined. You think your visioning is yours. You think these ideas are yours. You think there's a consensus among the community, but in fact that consensus has already been predetermined. Influencing our children. The goal of the United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, for which UNESCO is the lead agency, is to integrate the principles, values, and practices of sustainable development into all aspects of education and learning. Now understand what we said here. Sustainable development, the Agenda 21 version, has made its way into our communities in two methods. One is through development and through planning in the local community, and the other is through the education system. If we can change the minds of children and get them to think more placidly, get them to go along with things, it'll be an awful lot easier to implement this stuff which is anti-rights. So, the educational effort will encourage changes in behavior that create a more sustainable future. Now, how many people in this room sent your children to school to have their behavior changed? Any of you? I don't think so. I wanted to learn the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But instead, we're talking about changing people's behavior. And that's exactly what these programs do. The UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, which is right here, this is the overview of the program, is nothing but the 40 chapters of Agenda 21 put in a classroom training program and approved by the Department of Education and the National Education Association for use in the United States. Children are being taught that facts are man-made, and I'll show you where they're man-made. They're being taught about eliminating of disagreement, to rely on experts, and it's only okay to question certain ideas. I want to be able to question these things. Your kids are being taught not to question it, and I'm going to show you how. One way is through a program called Connected Math. This is the Connected Math Guidebook. This book is used throughout the United States of America. It's not in every single classroom. It's for grades 6 through 8. Standard 3. I'll take it right out of the book. Page 17. Through discussing problems and their solutions, students learn to reason. They learn that mathematics is man-made, that it is arbitrary, and good solutions are arrived at by consensus among those who are considered expert. So we no longer can just say that, hey, 3 times 3 is, well, we don't know. Because it's a consensus. Your children are being taught consensus. More and more through society, you're going to hear this term consensus pop up. Influencing our children. Now you might think that all this is just a bad mistake, like new math, and maybe we're just, we tried to teach our kids the right things, so we did a good job, but we kind of messed up. Well, I'm going to show you that that's not the case at all. What you're seeing here is intentional. And I got this right out of here, Education for Sustainable Development Toolkit, written by Rosalind McEwen. She's one of those experts. And here's what Rosalind had to say. Generally, more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. You get my connection? You think this is an accident? It's not. Nobody spends, to the best of my knowledge, spends more money on education than we do per child in the United States of America. And yet our grades keep dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. And part of the reason is because of exactly what you see in this booklet. If the kids are highly educated, they consume more, and that's going to be bad for the planet. Therefore, we only want them to know so much, and consensus is easy. If I get a kid that's been drilled consensus in his head, then he becomes very compliant. Working together, we can save our environment and keep our rights and freedoms. That is the real choice. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.